Gillespie, and I'm on the Stewardship Committee for Breakneck Hill, as well as I represent the Open Space Preservation Commissions. And I would like to, I'm honored to introduce Carolyn Dykema, our representative at the Mass House of Representatives. Carolyn has been a great advocate for the environment, and why she's here tonight is because she has legislation pending dealing with protecting our pollinators and bees due to problems they're encountering from the newest types of pesticides, neonicotinoids. Carolyn's also been a wonderful advocate for us, always supporting the Community Preservation Act, which has, as you know, we recently purchased the Burnett House. We protected that, and also prior to that we had done Chestnut Hill Farm, in addition to many other projects in town. So her support for the Community Preservation Act and the environment makes us very proud to welcome her here tonight to give us a few words about her legislation.
Thanks, Freddie. It's really great to be here, and I want to thank Freddie for her leadership on pretty much any environmental issue that you could ever come across. And it's really because of Freddie's efforts and all of the really active environmental advocates in the community of Southborough and in my district. You know, when I go up to the State House to be able to support things like the Community Preservation Act, it's not just me supporting, it's me representing the communities that I represent. So without the strong support in the communities, it makes it very difficult for me to do that. So it's really because of all of you, and you all deserve the recognition for programs like Community Preservation Act and for hopefully some legislation that we can move forward relative to pollinators and bees. And I know we have a great speaker here who I was just talking with a little bit about the science of bees, and I don't know that he's going to be speaking about the pesticide issue here tonight, but clearly when you're talking about pollinators and the importance of bees and bee health, pesticides are often come up as one of the concerns. And for those of you who read environmental news frequently, you might know about pollen collapse disorder and declining bee health. For those that don't, there's a very direct connection to each and every one of us, because pollinators and bees pollinate 1/3 of the global food supply. So there's a very direct connection between bee health and the rest of our health. So we have a very strong interest in following and protecting bee health. And what we've been seeing over the years, I'm no scientist certainly, but I've been following the science on looking at bees and these neonicotinoid pesticides, which have been in very broad use since roughly 2006. And if you correlate the use of these pesticides with the declines in bee health, there's some pretty strong correlations there. There's the science, as always, is challenging. There are a lot of arguments to be made on all sides, and certainly given the vested interests of a lot of people in various aspects of that issue, there's a very active conversation going on right now. But my bill specifically, House Bill 655, which was reported out of the Environment Committee favorably, which I'm very pleased for, it does a number of things, one of which is primarily to limit the amount of these pesticides that are used in the environment. Because of concerns that are being raised by beekeepers, some of them right here in Southborough, as well as scientists around the level of these pesticides in the environment. They're being used for crops to a great degree out in the Midwest, but there are many more of them being used here in Massachusetts than I think people suspect. They're used on garden plants, they're used on crops, a lot of which are in central and western Mass. And there are 5 types of these pesticides being used. So what this bill would do is it would essentially say, in order to use this category of pesticides, you would need to be a licensed pesticide applicator, which would essentially remove them from the shelves for retail use and ensure that those who use them properly. And here's why it's important. Recently, the EPA actually advanced the registration for one of these pesticides because of concerns, and they issued a report recently that give a very strong likelihood that anything above 25 parts per billion of these pesticides in the environment in bees has a very direct health effect on them, related to weakening and suppressing the immune system, which makes bees susceptible to other things, as well as other impacts. Anything below that has a much less impact. So we as a society have a great interest in keeping those pesticide levels low, recognizing that there are some valid uses for these things, important uses, but how do we use them sparingly? So that's really what my bill would do. One of the things that people don't think about, and I know there's a lot of talk about, how can we plant pollinator-friendly gardens, which is great and exciting for a lot of reasons. And that's plants like this. I noticed over here, bee-friendly things. Many of you have gone to the garden center to buy them. What you may not know is that these pesticides, which are systemics, which get actually absorbed up into the plant, which is why they're so effective, because it goes up and into the pollen where the pollinators get them. So if you're going to a garden center today, there is a very high likelihood that these pesticides have been used on these flowers. And not only that, there's really no way for you to know when you're buying one of these plants, whether you're getting a bee-friendly, non-neonicotinoid plant, or whether you're in fact planting something that could have a very damaging effect on the pollinators you're trying to support. So the bill that I filed would also require some labeling for plants that are coming into our garden centers so that consumers can make educated decisions. Interestingly, some of the larger garden centers, like I believe Lowe's, has already recognized, I think, the scientific concerns, but also a lot of consumer concerns as people are starting to ask more questions about this and are starting to be proactive in labeling. And one of the large retailers is actually going to be removing these products from their shelves in the next couple of years, which is great. But this legislation, I really believe, is kind of forcing some of these conversations, and with your help, we can continue to have them. And we're relying a lot on the scientists, like our speaker here tonight, to really provide the information and the clear direction that we need. So it's great to be a part of this. Again, it's great to be part of the community of Southborough and really hosting these forums to get the word out. And if anyone has any questions, I feel I'm welcome to take them. I have to go, unfortunately, tonight. I've got town meeting in another community. But,
are there any common names of retail products that we should be avoiding?
It's a lot of the household products that are made by Bayer. There are two companies, Bayer and the other one, I don't remember the name of it, but I can get those to Freddie, and Freddie can get those out so that we can start, because I agree, as homeowners, we can make proactive choices as well. So thank you very much.
So before we start our presentation, I just want to point out that, like I said, I'm on the Stewardship Committee, which is for Breakneck Hill Conservation Land, which is really ultimately managed under the control of our Conservation Commission. And I'd like to point out that we have our Conservation Commission Administrator, Beth Rosenblum, here tonight, Carl Geyer, who is a Conservation Commissioner, along with Michelle, who's also on the Stewardship Committee. I also have Joyce Greenleaf, who is the chair of the Stewardship Committee, here tonight. And like I said, this presentation is a joint one by the Open Space Preservation Commission and the Stewardship Committee, and I represent the Open Space Commission on that committee. And I'd like to identify, I have the 4 sitting commissioners here tonight. Can you come on up? Mimi Luttrell, our outgoing chair, Sean Conley, and Lisa Braccio. I want to congratulate Mimi. She was just elected to the planning board yesterday. She has been a member of the Open Space Commission for the past 13 years, chair for well over a decade. Sean and Lisa, in honor of your departure and the service you've done.
That doesn't have to be a nickel.
This is a native honeysuckle, good for hummingbirds that you have, as well as perfect for bumblebees. I purchased it at Garden in the Woods. So my hope is that this particularly will not have any neonicotinoids, and I'm doing my best not to cry, so on behalf. And did you want to say anything, or?
Thank you, everyone, for everyone's support. It was a wonderful campaign. I just felt so supported and uplifted and met so many great people, and I'm looking forward to getting to work on your planning board. Thank you.
And we're going to miss you. I was going to have a picture of really big shoes. Because we've got to find someone to help fill those, so thank you. And I'm really sorry because of some technical difficulties. I didn't upload some information I wanted to present tonight, so I will do that another time. But I wanted to introduce Robert Gegear. I want to say it right.
That's
Gegear.
It's been butchered before.
He is an associate professor at Worcester Polytech Institute, and if you're like me are wondering, you know, WPI in biology just didn't seem to be what you would think, but I had a whole list of a great introduction, but it's stuck on a hard drive in my purse. So I will say he does really cool stuff with science, you know, modeling and computerized and also on-the-ground surveys. And I was fortunate enough to go to a pollinator at Breakneck Hill. We have some pollinator habitat. First focus was on butterflies, and I went to a pollinator conference out in Petersham, Mass. At Harvard Forest. And he was one of the presenters, and lucky for me, he put his contact info on the handouts. So when I got home, I invited him if he would come take a walk at Breakneck Hill, and we were, like I said, serendipity. He was very excited. One of the first bumblebees he found was one of the ones that is declining statewide, and actually last summer had been listed as extirpated from the state. And thanks to work he has done, bees we found at Breakneck Hill, the state changed that draft into saying they're here, they're in trouble, we need to do more for them and do more studies. And that's just what we're doing. So I'm excited to present him and to, you know, actually hear what some of the findings were from last summer's work. So thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Hard to follow up all that earlier stuff. I will say that although I'm not talking about the pesticide issue as well as disease effects on pollinators, I am giving a talk for in Norfolk, Mass, May 18th, that will cover all of the research we've been doing on pesticides. So if you want to hear more about what we're doing, I can give you more information after this talk. So today, as the title suggests, I'm talking about Breakneck Hill bumblebees. More specifically, I'm talking about some of the research we're doing at Breakneck Hill to try to get a better understanding of, first of all, the causes of pollinator decline, so why are our pollinators in decline. But I'm also trying to figure out what are the consequences of those declines for ecosystem health, for biodiversity, focusing really on our native plants and then the animals that rely on our native plants for things like food, shelter, and nest sites. So just to give you a general overview of what I want to cover today, try to give you the express version of the material. I'm going to start off just, so we're focused on pollinator decline. I just want to talk a little bit about what a pollinator is, why it's important. Bring the plant perspective in, which is a really important but often overlooked component of pollinator decline. Talk a little bit about bumblebees as pollinators, and then shift gears, talk about bumblebee decline, and this Beecology crowdsourcing project that I initiated last summer. This is a citizen science project where hopefully some of you will become involved to collect data that will go into a database at WPI and will help us to figure out what's going on with the pollinators. I'm going to then shift and talk about some of the data we collected at Breakneck Hill. Now what's interesting, as Freddie mentioned, my first visit to Breakneck Hill, I found a bumblebee that was in decline. It's interesting, the whole summer we only found another 10 of them, so I was really lucky that I found one the first time out. So we started collecting data, and we've analyzed those data, and this is the first time that I've presented the results, and there are some really interesting things that have come out of the study at Breakneck, and we've since expanded to Wachusett Meadow, Cass Meadow, a lot of other areas to get more data, but that's how interesting the results were, and so I'll talk about some of those. Today, of course, we're continuing our work at Breakneck and expanding to butterflies and looking at birds as well, bee-bird interactions, which is an interesting take on things. And then I'm going to finish by talking about how you might be able, how you could volunteer and some of where we plan to go with things at Breakneck. So to start off, you know, you hear a lot about pollinators and pollination, and the term itself really is a plant-based term. So we hear a lot about bees and animals, but the idea and the importance of a pollinator is really, you have to look at things or at least appreciate the plant perspective. So in flowering plants, and most plant species on the planet are flowering plants or angiosperms, sexual reproduction is achieved. So plants, because they can't move around to find a mate, need to find another way to do so. So in plants, the way they reproduce, just like the way that we reproduce in other animals, there's a male component and a female component. The male component is called pollen. And then the pollen needs to be transferred to the stigma, which is the female component. And what's interesting in this process, which is pretty straightforward, both the male and the female part can be contained within the same flower. They could be on different flowers on the same plant. But if you think of a plant as an individual, even though it's got lots of flowers, it wants to move its gametes to another plant of the same species. That's how it maximizes its reproductive success, as well as it wants to receive pollen from the same species. So you could think of the plant as having both this male and female function. So pollination then is the act of the transfer of the pollen to the stigma. Now, the way that this is done in some plants is through the wind or through water. Okay, and so if any of you that have allergies are familiar with this mode of pollination, you can see these clouds. So in the grasses, most of them are wind pollinated, but there's a problem with wind pollination, and that is your gametes go wherever the wind decides to blow, right? So if your mate's over here and the wind's blowing over here, you're out of luck until the wind shifts direction. So it's a very costly and risky type of pollination, and so the pollen that these plants are producing is really low quality. It's like this big bang approach where they throw tons of pollen in and hope some of it finds a stigma. Most plants employ the services of animals to do the job. So 90% of flowering plant species, and again, flowering plants are the most abundant type of plant, they employ the services of these animals. Now, this postage stamp from a few years ago sort of shows you the different groups of pollinators. So we've got, bats are pollinators, hummingbirds, we've got butterflies, and this is a bumblebee. And this stamp is a little bit misleading, because if we look at all the pollinators, so there are about 100 to 200,000 pollinator species on the planet, only about 1,000 are vertebrates. So the vast majority of the pollinators on the planet are insects, and of those, the bees make up a good portion. They play an important role in most terrestrial ecosystems, and in North America we have about 4,000 bee species. So although I'm focused on bumblebees, and you hear a lot about honeybees, honeybees is effectively one species. There are other species not in North America, and honeybees aren't native to North America. So in terms of native bees, we have about 4,000 species, and bumblebees make a subset of those species, and they're important pollinators in a lot of systems. So I've mentioned it. I agreed to do this. I agreed to do a bumblebee workshop with Freddie. We haven't set a date yet. So I'm just going to, the bumblebees are the black and yellow fuzzy bees that you might see. At this time of the year, the queens are a good size. Some of them can be the size of a small mouse, flying around looking for nest sites. And so here are some pictures that I took at Breakneck. So we've got, this is the one that I'm really interested in, Bombus fervidus. You can see they vary in their color pattern. And we use those color patterns to try to ID the different species. This is a spider that has a Bombus griseocolus worker, and this again was at Breakneck. And this gives you an idea of bumblebee nests. So bumblebees nest either on the surface, the surface nesters, or they use abandoned rodent holes to find nests. So bumblebees are often very confused with other bees and other types of insects. So wasps, like this yellow jacket, are often confused because of the black-yellow pattern, but wasps have nests that look like this. Bumblebees, again, are underground or surface nests that look like this. Flies, so they're a really good bee mimic fly. So this is actually a fly, although it looks exactly like a bumblebee. And this wasn't taken at Breakneck, but I do have one that's very similar looking. So in terms of IDing, people are often confused with these flies. And interestingly, these flies have evolved behaviors that are very bumblebee-like. So they'll take their forelegs and put their forelegs up on the sides of their heads to make their antennae look longer, because they have short antennae. They actually buzz to try to sound like a bumblebee. So we've got flies, we've got moths like this hawk moth, this hummingbird moth. I saw a few of these at Breakneck. We've got carpenter bees, which look very similar in that they're black and yellow, but they have a shiny abdomen, and they're the things that they're digging, they're boring holes in your decks and wood. That's where they form their nests. And then we have honeybees. So the honeybees, this is what a honeybee looks like. And again, Honey Nut Cheerios, they tend to have honeybees looking black and yellow, but those tend to be the bumblebee color patterns. Bumblebees are more on the orangish side. And this is what a typical honeybee hive looks like. It's managed. There are feral honeybee hives, and they need a large area to nest in, a large cavity, because their colonies get up to 10, 20,000 versus bumblebees that can get up to a couple of thousand depending on the conditions and the nest site. Okay, so that's what our focal group, pollinator group, the bumblebees. Now what's interesting is the bumblebee life cycle. So you hear a lot about colony collapse disorder. You also hear a lot about bumblebees, but most of what you hear about is in an agricultural context, which I'll get to in a minute. And those bees are all managed. So they reproduce through artificial insemination a lot of times, or they're put into a flight cage in companies, and then the colonies are shipped out. But the bees that are surviving in the wild have to figure out where they're going to nest and raise the young on their own. And so bumblebees have an annual life cycle. So in the winter, the mated queens hibernate. When things warm up in the spring, the queens will leave. At this time of the year, you'll see them flying around searching for nest sites. So you'll see them flying low to the ground away from flowers, and you'll see them landing. They're searching for those abandoned rodent nests or a good spot to set up shop. If they find a nest, they'll start to collect nectar and pollen, and they'll lay eggs in the ball of pollen that they form. So it's shown here, those eggs will hatch, and that first brood of workers then does all the jobs. From that point forward, the queen stays in the colony until the queen dies at the end of the summer. So if you do see a queen flying around with pollen on her legs, that means she's already found a nest. So that's a good thing. If she doesn't have pollen on her legs, then she's still looking, and that's not a good thing, because if she doesn't find a nest site, then that's it. She'll just die out later in the summer. So through the summer, we tend to see the workers. Okay, and just to give you an idea of what a bumblebee colony looks like, it's the same as general idea as a honeybee colony. They're eusocial. They have division of labor. So you've got the queen, you've got workers that have different jobs to do. Some feed the young, some guard the nest, some help out the queen, and some foragers, a subset, go out of the colony and they visit flowers to collect food in the form of pollen and nectar, and they bring it back to the colony. So all they do all day, the foragers just go out, collect food, and bring it back, nonstop. And the workers are all non-reproductive, so their sole task is to go out and find food. So that's what you're going to see through the summer. At the end of the summer, you're going to start to see larger bees again, the queens, and also males come out at the end of the summer. They find each other, mate. The queen then looks for a place to overwinter. Everybody else dies with the first hard frost, and then the queen overwinters and the cycle begins. So when we're thinking about bee decline and possible spots that could influence bumblebee populations, clearly if they can't find a place to overwinter, or if we don't have good snow cover, that's going to affect bumblebee populations. If they can't find nests, that's going to affect bumblebee populations. If they don't have enough resources to build up the numbers to get the resources to put out males and queens, that's going to affect the population. And if males can't find queens because the numbers are too low, that's going to affect the population. So, if you think about it in terms of, these managed colonies that are given all the food they need and they're able to sustain, and you think about the effect on the workers, this is where the focus tends to be. But in the wild bees, we have to worry about all these other aspects of the life cycle when we think about what's causing decline. And so that complicates things incredibly, and one of the main reasons is because we have 4,000 species and we don't know anything about 99% of them. And even the bumblebees, as you'll see today, they tend to be lumped together as a single unit, but there are 46 species in North America, and each one is adapted to do different things. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. And people tend to generalize from honeybees to bumblebees, pesticide effects, whatever it is, and it's just not like that. There are species-specific effects, and I'm going to show you some data to support that view later in the talk. So switching gears then, we have a sense of bumblebees, what they are and what their life cycle is. Now looking at the global problem of pollinator decline. So there are many bumblebee species that are in decline in North America, and also globally. So there are different species. There are some species that are close to extinction, and this has happened at a very rapid rate. So when I was going through graduate school, there was Bombus affinis was so abundant that I was trying to find flowers. So this species bites holes in tubular flowers and steals nectar. So I was trying to find them without a hole in them. I couldn't find them anywhere. That's how abundant this species was. 5 years later, I couldn't find it anywhere. And I hunted all over the place to try to find this species. And since that time, it's close to extinction. There are a few individuals found from year to year, but the numbers aren't anywhere near what they were. In Massachusetts, this was one of the top most abundant species. This one and another one that's in decline. Now I can't find it anywhere. And there are species in the same subgenus that are also in decline, like this one. So these species are in a state of decline, and you've heard about colony collapse disorder. So there's something going on with honeybees as well, and we've also probably heard about monarch butterflies. Their numbers are in trouble, and so, for unknown causes. So a lot of the research that's going on is trying to figure out the causes, and we're certainly interested in that, but we're also interested in the consequences of these declines. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. What I want to point out first is that, so here, these are data from a paper by Kalla and Packer. Sheila Kalla was one of my undergraduate students when I was postdocing at University of Toronto. And so she conducted a study comparing bee abundance, current bee abundance to historical records in a particular area in Canada. And what she found was, sure enough, there were certain species in decline. What's interesting, and what's sort of the dirty little secret of bee decline, is that there are many bumblebee species that are doing better than ever right now. So we have all these species, and we talk about decline, and certainly there are species in decline, like the one I mentioned, that are close to extinction, but there are also species, like Bombus impatiens, and I'll talk about that in a second, that are more abundant than they've ever been. It's like they're immune to these effects, or they're definitely able to deal with some of these effects. And what's going on is when we look at the effects of pesticide and disease, we use these model bees like a honeybee or a Bombus impatiens. Well, Bombus impatiens, as you can see right here, this is what it was in 1970, in the 70s, to what it was in the early 2000s. You can see there's a dramatic increase in that species. This is the model that we're using to test effective neonicotinoid pesticides. So it's clearly, if pesticides are causing the decline, this species isn't as susceptible to those effects as some of these other ones that are in decline. And that's another thing that we're really trying to address with our research, is actually looking at the species in decline and trying to understand what makes them unique. Okay, and so why do we care? I think at this point probably every one of you knows that pollinators are important. We heard 1/3 of every bite of food we take is generated by a pollinator. And so, in an agricultural context, the social and economic importance of pollinators is getting a lot of press, right? If we lose our pollinators, it's going to affect our food supply. Bumblebees play a major role in this. Honeybees play a major role, and there are other bees that play a major role. So there are these specialist bees like squash bees that do a really good job pollinating certain crop plants. But what I want to point out with this is that the agricultural issue is more of an abundance issue, right? You just need something to pollinate your crops. You don't need 14 different species to pollinate your crops. If one species is abundant and is highly abundant and can do the job, then you get the job done, right? So that's one way to look at things, and there's a lot of focus, again, on the one species of bumblebee and honeybees and some of these other bees. What I want to draw to your attention, and this is, I put this up just to show you the importance of pollination. So here's a bee-pollinated strawberry, one that's self-pollinated, so the pollen is transferred within the same plant. And this is with a little bit of help from the wind. And obviously you're not going to buy something that looks like this or this when you go into the grocery store, looking at the effect of blueberries. So with and without pollinators, clearly they're very important to us. And in fact, in China, they've wiped out pollinators, and now everybody has to go around and hand pollinate the fruit trees because they don't have any pollinators to do it. And you can imagine, in fact, here, we had a lot of greenhouse tomatoes. They were all pollinated with these magic wands. So they would get people to go around with these vibrators because tomato flowers need to be what's buzz pollinated or vibrated, sonicated. And so they'd go around with these wands and touch every single flower in these greenhouses that are the size of like 3 football fields. And then somebody realized that, hey, if we put one colony of bumblebees in there, they can do a far better job pollinating, and they're much more cost effective. And so from that point, these bumblebee industries crept up. They started in Europe and they started in North America around the mid-90s, I think it was, when the two major companies came into North America. And since that time, we've got bumblebees in a box now, and we take advantage of that in the lab, especially through the winter when I'm not going out to Breakneck to collect any bees during the winter. So anyway, so what I want to draw to your attention is the ecological importance of pollinators. So pollinators are what are known as keystone species. And so if you think about a bee visiting a plant, that plant is going to get pollinated, so the plant can reproduce. The plant's going to produce seeds and fruit, which is going to feed things like chipmunks and birds and deer. The plant material is going to be used for nest sites. It's going to be used for cover from predators. Those predators are feeding on this level. So if you knock out this bee and the plants start dying out, it's going to have a cascading consequence through at the ecosystem level. And so that's always, in addition to we're going to run out of food if we lose pollinators. If we start losing pollinators, it's going to have these effects. The problem is, I mentioned 4,000 bee species. We have no clue what the relationship is between bees and plants at the species level, and how those like if I knock out a particular bee species that's affecting a particular plant species, what effect that has at these different levels. We have no clue. And so our research is trying to fill these gaps. It's interesting. I mean, people have been interested in bumblebees forever. There's publications from Massachusetts from the late 1800s talking about all the species. It's great historical data. But a lot of the key things, like what do bees really need at the species level, really hasn't been addressed. And so we're trying to address some of these things at Breakneck. Anyway, so causes of decline. You've heard about pesticides. Originally, it was thought that some sort of new disease or increase in disease prevalence was causing decline. That shifted to pesticides. Now people are focused on the interaction between the two. Climate change has been proposed. Invasive species, so that's either invasive plant species disrupting the interaction between native plants and pollinators, or non-native pollinators disrupting that interaction. And then there's habitat changes, right? If you're putting up a parking lot, you're wiping out habitat, that's going to have an effect. So interestingly, people acknowledge that these two things are probably the leading cause of pollinator decline, but they're so hard to study that everybody's focused on these two. So certainly it's probably a combination of everything, and there are these interactive effects that people talked about earlier. So people in the lab, I have grad students working on infectious agents and pesticides, and it definitely affects behavior and can cause effects on their abilities as pollinators. But today I'm focused more on these two, and I've got a grad student, Ellen Pierce, that's working on this at Breakneck. So what I want to point out to you, so putting things more in an ecological context, is that all bumblebee species, there's one specialist species that's in Scandinavia, but all North American bumblebee species are what are called floral generalists. That means that they will visit pretty much anything they can get their tongues into that has nectar and pollen. The fact that some of the plants you buy at nurseries and things may have neonicotinoids was brought up. A bigger problem is that a lot of those plants don't have nectar and pollen. A lot of the cultivars, they breed it out of them. They try to make a showy flower, and you think, oh, look at this great color. These bees are going to love this, and it's a wasteland. And I've run into this problem too. I was doing a study on an aconitum species, and I went to my local nursery, and I got all these plants, and the bees went in and they wouldn't touch it. And I'm like, what's going on? Sure enough, I went in, they weren't producing nectar. It was bred out of them. So it's a large, and so when you go in, ask, or open up the flower, there's a nectary in there, squeeze it, and just, if you put your tongue to it, although if you can see a fluid, maybe that's a better way, because I don't want anybody to get sick. But just take a look that it has nectar. And what I'm going to see today is that the fact that that plant has both nectar and pollen does not matter. The bees prefer certain plants for nectar, certain plants for pollen. And so just like the bees aren't one size fits all, plants aren't one size fits all either. And that's a major problem, because you go in, all these pollinator mixes that even conservation groups are promoting, and they will service maybe 2 out of the 26 species that are available for bumblebees, even though bumblebees love them. Some do, but the diversity, we've got to focus, and the take-home message from the ecological side is that diversity matters. Keeping bumblebee diversity and abundance is what we really want to focus on, because we have no clue what taking one of those pieces of the puzzle out, what effect it has on plant species. If there are these really tight relationships between species, we lose one of the components, we don't know what that effect is. So it's better to maintain diversity until we figure out how tight-knit those relationships are. Anyway, so most bees are floral generalists. They're highly intelligent, these bees. 99% of what a bee does on a daily basis is based on learning and memory, not instinct. So this idea that bees are attracted to certain colors, and even hummingbirds is misleading. Okay, they're looking for the nectar. If the nectar's good, they associate it with colors, odors, shapes, and they use that to drive their foraging decisions. They might be biased in some way, and we're going to talk about that today, but that doesn't mean they're fixed, right? If it's not good, they'll switch to something else. So there's that component. The other thing is that if we look at flowers, they have different colors, odors. They also have different morphologies, right? Flowers come in a variety of shapes. And so they could be closed-tubed or open-tubed. And interestingly, our bumblebees come with different tongue lengths. So this one, you can see its tongue, it looks like an elephant. It's got a really long tongue. Some species have really short tongues. And if you can picture, 26 species in the same area, they have to partition themselves out. Otherwise, the competition would drive one of them out, right? So they've partitioned themselves, and a lot of the bees are partitioning themselves based on tongue length. So there's a good fit between species and what the shape of the flower. But there are also species that have the same tongue length. And the question is, how are they partitioning themselves, okay, to minimize this competition? And let's see. Here we go. So I've got some video, and I apologize. I wasn't sure what the size of the screen was going to be. All right, there goes the video, jumping ahead. Okay. Oh, there it is. Wait for it. Okay. So to give you an idea, this is, hopefully I don't say anything because I didn't realize the volume was up. So this is a Bombus impatiens on goldenrod, and you can see that the bee lands on the flower. You can see its little tongue, it's just poking its tongue in. So this would be one type of flower, and this can be accessed by a wide variety of pollinators, right? You can get flies, anything with any tongue length can get access here. Interestingly, long-tongued bees have trouble. You think of an elephant's trunk, it's hard to manipulate, in bumblebees anyway, in butterflies it's a bit different. It's hard for them to manipulate their tongues. So long-tongued bees will avoid something like this for nectar because they're less efficient and they're getting outcompeted by these medium and short-tongued species. Now, if we look at something like this non-native toadflax, butter and eggs, if you can see this, this is actually the more interesting of the two videos. So in this, the nectar is located at the base of the spike, and what the bee does, you can see that it has to pry open the petals to crawl inside to get that nectar. And this bee this is Bombus fervidus. It has the longest tongue out of one of the longest out of any of the bees in the area. And you can see its long tongue, so it pokes down. And so it has a competitive advantage on this type of flower. And so the long tube and these long-tongued bees have co-evolved, and they have a unique relationship. And then we've got other short-tongued, medium-tongued bees that have co-evolved with other plant species. And so what we're doing is, at Breakneck, is we're trying to understand these relationships. We're trying to understand what's called specialization between plants and pollinators. And so even though bumblebees are generalists and they can visit a wide variety of things, what we're looking at is whether species have particular preferences. So it's like, you'll eat fast food if you're forced to, but if you have the choice, you might select something more nutritious, right? So we're generalists in the way we eat, but we certainly have preferences. And we're looking for the same thing in bees, because that's poorly understood. And so what I initiated was this, what I'm calling, I tried to come up with some catchy term, beecology, to emphasize the ecological component of the research, the Ecology Crowdsourcing Project. And our goal is to collect extensive species-level data on bumblebees and their interactions with flowering plants, right? So we want to know what is the bee species, but we also want to know what is it visiting and also what else is available to try to understand these preferences on both sides. And what we're going to do is we've already started this, we're creating a public database at WPI. We're developing a phone app that you're going to be able to enter data into the database, and then the database is publicly accessible, so you can take a look, you can test your own hypothesis, collect data to try to understand decline. So this is both for the public and researchers. And so we're focused on these ecological hypotheses, and what we're trying to do is accelerate conservation and restoration efforts. Specifically, when pollinator gardens were mentioned earlier, and there's one at Breakneck, what do you plant in a pollinator garden? The real answer to that question is we don't know. We don't know what you need to plant in your garden in order to maintain diversity. We know what we see certain bees on. In the case of bumblebees, we have no idea if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or if it's going to maintain diversity or not. We just know it's going to attract something. And so that's what we're really trying to address with our research, so that we can restore particular areas and we can develop these pollinator gardens that will maintain diversity, because that's the key if we want to keep our ecosystems healthy. So Breakneck Hill, for those of you that haven't been out there, it's a nice walk. This is later in the summer, and this picture is actually covering the cows that were over here. When we did most of our surveys, they were behind the fence. This is an overview, so this isn't a surprise to anybody. But what I want to point out is that we conducted weekly surveys, intensive surveys, starting in June going through October. And so basically we started here at the parking lot, and we were just zigzagging all the way through the entire property. We didn't access the north and south pastures. This year we hope to get into here a little bit to see what's going on. In particular, I think the south pasture has a lot of bumblebee nests. But we basically looked at every bee and every bee plant interaction weekly from June to October. And then, and so here are some of the results. And for some reason my pictures didn't come up here. So I had pictures of each one of the bumblebee species shown here. So here are the species names, the Latin names. What I want to point out is this is for the whole summer. So you'll notice that there were, for this species, this is the most abundant one that I talked about, there were over 3,000 observations for this species. And you can see that the second in line, 493, 163, it drops off considerably. Okay, so this is consistent with what we know about what's going on in eastern North America. This one's doing really well. These other ones aren't doing very well. This is the one I talked about, Bombus fervidus, that we only found 12 individuals through the whole summer. If we look at periods where all of these species occurred together, this number drops down to close to 493. I think it was 480 something. So what's happening is these species are all overlapping for 4 or 5 weeks at Breakneck, and then what happens is all these species finish their cycle, and this one is the only one left, and it sort of rules the roost. It has access to everything available, and it's just, you can, because it doesn't have any competition, you can see how that would increase number. So that explains why the species is doing so well. And if we look at the distribution of these, oh, here we go. I didn't know it was on a timer. I apologize for that. I should know my own talk. Anyway, so I have, every good talk has a handout that goes along with it. So I've got a handout with all these species, and if you're up at Breakneck and you want to try to ID some species, you can take a look at that. So here's what the species that I observed. So there were 6 species that I observed through the summer. And so if we look at those species, and what their abundance was from June to October, so I showed you the overall numbers. This is looking at it week to week. You can see that there's a period between June going into the first or second week of July where all of the species are peaking, right? Actually, did I have a... So there's a period of overlap that's 5 or 6 weeks here, and then all of a sudden these species leave, and you can see Bombus impatiens. It actually continues to rise, increase in number, and it peaks around the end of August and persists all the way through into October, into the first hard frost. So impatiens is around from June all the way through until it's so cold that it can't survive. So it's a very this is alone is an interesting finding, but what's really interesting is when you compare it to historical data. So I acknowledge these are a bit messy, so I'll highlight a few things. So here are data from 1960 in the area, Massachusetts, data on bumblebees from 1960 to 1990, and then again from 2005 to 2013. And what's interesting is you notice at Breakneck, it's very similar to what's going on here. These drop off significantly, and you see impatiens that continues to rise. If we look historically, there were species that were peaking around the same time as impatiens. So impatiens is in purple. These are Bombus vagans, Bombus fervidus. They were all peaking around the same time. Those are the species in decline. What's interesting? That's interesting about that. This, and why that is, and we're looking, if this pattern holds, it suggests that there's something going on at the climate change level that might be changing what are called phenologies, so that's the colony cycle, that those phenologies have shifted for some reason, and Bombus impatiens hasn't shifted. And so this is a very interesting finding and consistent with data at other locations from 2005 to 2013. And this is pre-decline, this is post-decline, and obviously in 2015, that pattern seems to hold. So these results were very, very interesting. Looking now at this idea that there's specialization, so we found that there were over this period of 4 to 5 weeks where all of the bumblebees, all 6 bumblebee species were available. Okay, and bumblebees, they can fly 5 miles from their hive to get food. So the fact that there's a lot of acreage at Breakneck is not limiting the bees. Those bees can cover the entire area. So they're all overlapping and all competing with one another. And so over that period, there were over 25 plant species available to the bees. And I think we saw a bumblebee on 23 of those plant species. But if we look at the proportion of visits for species, we see something, what I think is remarkable. Remember, these bees have been they're presented as generalists that can do anything. But look at Bombus impatiens. 60% of its visits were to 2 things. Bombus grissiocolus, almost 80%, 75% of its visits were to milkweed alone. Bombus bimaculatus, red clover and vetch, almost 100% on 2 things. Bombus vagans, okay? Bombus perplexus, bush honeysuckle, which is a native, and also milkweed. So it split its time up. Most of its visits were to 2 things. Bombus fervidus, vetch and red clover. So what this shows is that even though these bees, and a lot of these, have equal tongue lengths, that doesn't explain this partitioning. We know the plant species are rewarding. We know all species can have access, but they're partitioning themselves and specializing to a level that hasn't been demonstrated before. And so when you ask, what do I plant in my garden? Well, if you want to maintain diversity, you should be planting, well, a lot of these are non-natives, and I'll talk about that in a second. But if you want to maintain diversity, hopefully you can see that if I plant one thing, I'm going to be missing something. It's just the way that it's going to be. So think something like milkweed, and those of you that are involved with Monarch Watch have probably heard about milkweed and monarchs. That milkweed is an exclusive food source for Bombus grissiocolus. So if we get rid of milkweed, not only are we hurting monarchs, but grissiocolus now has to compete with all these other ones and likely will decrease because it's not as good. There's something about milkweed that not only grissiocolus likes, but these other generals like Bombus impatiens that will visit pretty much anything. I didn't see a single Bombus impatiens on milkweed. And so why is that? And we're looking at these mechanisms in the lab right now, and it turns out, well, I'll save that story for another time, but I have insight into why they're partitioning and how the plants are actually doing this. Now, this was for nectar, okay? So this is bees just looking for nectar. What was absolutely astounding was when you look at bees, plant species, number of plant species where bees were actively collecting pollen, right? Look at this. 3 of the species, first of all, I didn't see any pollen on Bombus fervidus. It wasn't collecting any pollen. This is the one that's in serious trouble. This is a concern, and I would be surprised if I see fervidus at Breakneck this year because the numbers are so low and I didn't see any pollen, which is a terrible sign. They need pollen to produce reproductives and to grow the hive. It's their source of protein. So bees they can't survive without nectar. That's their fuel, right? But they can survive long periods of time without pollen. They don't need the pollen as much as they need the nectar. They absolutely need the pollen to produce new bees. And so if they don't have pollen, they're in trouble. Now, St. John's wort, all of the species overwhelmingly selected or preferred St. John's wort for pollen. Now, that doesn't mean these other plant species where I saw bees collecting nectar didn't have pollen. Bees actively collecting pollen, meaning they do this buzzing. There's a very stereotypical behavior associated with pollen collection. And I only saw it on bees from these 3 species doing it on St. John's wort, and this meadow sweet as well. I saw Bombus impatiens and Gricicolis doing some pollen collection there as well. So this is extremely troubling because this is a non-native. So the question is, what natives did it replace? Like, what would those bees be feeding on, right? So it suggests that one of the potential mechanisms for decline is that maybe an invasive species outcompeted some natives that helped to partition them, and now they're all competing for one pollen resource, and it's whoever is the fastest at collecting pollen is going to be the one that's putting out the reproductives, and the other ones are going to lose out, and that's a major source of selection. So this is something we're following up as well at other sites. Now, if we look at each of the, so we're going to flip the tables a little bit, and we're going to look at the plant species. So the bees had 25 plus plant species to choose from, and they limited it. Now, each of the plant species has 6 bees to choose from, right? The bees are equally like more or less, except for Furvitus and maybe Vagans to some extent. Certainly, bees have access to all these different resources, but if you look from the plant side as well, we see this high level of specialization. Raspberry, we only saw Bombus perplexus, 1 species of bumblebee. It goes down the line. Milkweed, we saw Gricicolis, most of the bees on there, Gricicolis. Spreading dogbane, we just saw Bombus impatiens. Meadowsweet, it goes down the line. So what the take-home message here is that not only do we have bees specializing and have certain needs, plants have certain needs as well. And so if we start losing some of these species, these plants are going to be in trouble. All right, because it's likely that the reason that it's attracting a subset of these species is because they're more effective pollinators. So yes, plants can be pollinated and visited by a number of things, but if they're crappy pollinators, it's going to affect the plant reproduction. Okay, so we need to consider that as well. So the other interesting thing that came out of this, so I was talking about plant species in general. If I partition native versus non-native species at Breakneck, another, I think, remarkable finding. So natives in green, and you can see that a couple of the bumblebee species show a strong preference for native species. But others are showing a strong preference for non-native. So thinking about this from the plant's perspective, if you have a non-native coming into an area and all of the bees are drawn to it, what's happening to the natives? They're not getting pollinators, or they're getting crappy pollinators or less effective pollinators, and that's going to have an effect on them. So this is striking that we see Bombus impatiens, jack of all trades, that tends to prefer, but Bombus bimaculatus only visited non-natives, and Bombus furvitus, the few that I saw, were only on non-natives. And they tended to be longer tube flowers, and the question is, what were those? Vetch was one of them, and cow vetch was one, and red clover was the other. So what did those species knock out in terms of native species? So another animated thing. So the other thing that came out of this that was very interesting is, so we know that there's a preference for non-natives. What about the effects of the non-natives? Do we have any evidence for this magnet effect of these non-natives? So we've got 3 things. Spreading dogbane and goldenrod are natives. Purple loosestrife is a highly invasive non-native. All right. So we look at, so here are so this is at a time where only Bombus impatiens was available, so this is past that 6-week window. But if we look at the number of visits on dogbane, we see before purple loosestrife comes in, so this is showing you when dogbane, loosestrife, and goldenrod are in bloom, we see that we get some impatiens, but as soon as goldenrod comes in, we don't see any more impatiens on dogbane, right? Even though it's still in bloom for another 2 or 3 weeks, there were very few impatiens observed. So we got all of the Bombus impatiens were visiting purple loosestrife, and then the goldenrod comes in, right? Goldenrod started blooming back here. We didn't start seeing bees on it until here, and still it didn't start to increase until we started to see a decrease in the purple loosestrife. So this is, again, 1 year's worth of data. Take it with a grain of salt. But this suggests that the loosestrife, and if we look at the next slide, the loosestrife was in a small area right here. So we've got goldenrod that's covering every white section that you can see up here. We've got Queen Anne's lace. We've got the spreading dogbane was in major patches through here. This small patch of purple loosestrife sucked all the bees to that small area. And you could just, again, It's a very interesting finding. 78% of the bees that we observed were on purple loosestrife, and that maintained through the loosestrife bloom. So we're trying to figure out what's so good about loosestrife in the lab as well. But this, again, it's a troubling finding if you think about things from native plants perspective, right, or the perspective of native plants. So to wrap things up then, and well, probably over time, so I'm rambling on for a while. Just to wrap up, the take-home message, that there are these species-specific preferences, both from the plant's perspective, native plants, and the pollinator's perspective. So when you're planting your garden, you want diversity. What do we think about? We want to think about the tongue length of those bumblebees, but we also want to think about things that are less obvious. And our research, I suggest to plant milkweed. Bush honeysuckle was another one, a native that was loved, the yellow wild indigo. I have a list now of these species that would maintain a high diversity at Breakneck or would in a garden. The species are varying in their preference for native and non-native. This, again, has important consequences for the conservation of native plant species. And I think that these non-natives, and again, this year and next year will help to support this idea that these non-natives certainly have the potential to disrupt native plant-pollinator interactions, if not outcompete natives, and may, again, if a bumblebee species likes a native, a non-native plant species comes in and wipes it out, then that bee now is at a competitive disadvantage, and that is a viable mechanism of decline, right? If it can't compete, it's not going to be able to put out the reproductives to continue that cycle. And so we need to think about these things. The other important thing here is we need to think about nectar and pollen sources in terms of plants separately. It's not one size fits all. If you go into the garden center, you want to pull a plant, you want to check for that nectar, it has tons of nectar, but you also want to check the pollen. And we're trying to figure out what is it about St. John's wort pollen that is so good. Is it the protein content? Does it have certain compounds in it that the bees seem to prefer? Once we figure that out, then we can start to look for plants with that compound, and that will really accelerate conservation efforts, right? If we know this is a great pollen source for a wide variety of species and it's a native, we can help to restore these habitats where there are high levels of human disturbance. And so I just want to finish with, sort of what's going on this year. As I said, we're going to be doing additional study sites. We're certainly focused on Breakneck, and everybody here, if you want to volunteer, that would be great. I hope to run a Bumblebee ID workshop. So even if you're just walking through and you see a bumblebee and you take a picture and you send it to me, that's great. Any way you could help out would be amazing. If you have a garden with a wide variety of species, I'd love for you to take pictures. Tell me what's in your garden. I can look at the species diversity to try to link those two things together. Every little bit helps. If you want to be involved in the main project where we're generating the database, you go through the workshop, you get your Beecologist t-shirt, and then you go, I send you out and you collect data and you send it to me. And we have students, being at WPI, it's great because it's a tech. All the engineers, they're working on apps, they're working on the database, and I just, as an ecologist, I can take advantage of these things. The other interesting thing is we're working on ecological tools to be able to assess pesticide levels and disease levels in pollinators. So I can collect a single bee, and I can tell you, is it under pesticide stress or is it under a disease stress? So that technology we're working on as well, and I think in the next year or less than a year, we're going to have these tools available so we can go to different environments. We can look to see what is the pesticide level. And I guess the legislation is focusing on 25 parts per billion. If you come to my talk, and I'm not trying to recruit you to my talk at Norfolk, but I know that at 7 parts per billion, at 10 parts per billion, it has a negative effect on bees. And this is the bee species that's resilient. And the problem is people focus on acute doses, right? So 25 parts per billion as a one-shot deal, but bees visit thousands of flowers a day. And if they have small amounts of the pesticide, it builds up. And I'm telling you, so we did a 1-week feeding trial at 10 parts per billion. At day 5, all of the bees were dead. And interestingly, and this is the important part from the ecological perspective, is that male bees died in 3 days. So no one is even talking about male bees. And in fact, the EPA when they test these pesticides, they first of all test them on honeybees, and they don't test males, they don't test queens, and they don't test workers. So we've done that work, and there's clearly a sex difference, a caste difference in bumblebees, and we haven't even looked at the species in decline yet. This is the species that's healthy where we're seeing these effects. So it's clear that neonicotinoids are having a problem, and we really need to get more of an ecological perspective on things to understand what the effects of these pesticides are. And so I'll finish with some information about me. Freddie was nice enough to put together this Breakneck Hill Facebook site, so you can go on there and see what's going on and post some pictures, or you can send them to me directly at this email site. But in particular, this is Bombus fervidus. This was taken at Breakneck Hill. Because there was only one, I followed it around for an hour to get a good picture of it. I didn't want to let it go, but I had to. And so this is what it looks like. It's pretty. It's got a black band on the thorax, and it's all yellow, so it's a pretty easy one to identify compared to some of the others. The other one in decline is this one. It's Bombus vagans. It's got a black dot on it, and it's got two bands. It's called, I think it's called the common name's half black, half yellow bee or something like that, and it's because there are two yellow bands and two black bands. This one goes all the way down here. And so if you want to learn a bit more about the different species and things, I have a cheat sheet here that usually I hand out at my IDs, workshops, but you can certainly, I have some, I think, for everybody, and you can go out and test your bumblebee ID skills, and please send me pictures if you have them. People have said that if you take a short video, if you have the phone that can do it, and then just capture an image, because you'll notice these bees move pretty quickly, and it's hard to get a great image. But if you take a short video, you can stop the video when it's at the right position and just take a frame and send it to me. That was a good suggestion by one of the volunteers from last year. So with that, I'll take questions. I'm sorry if I went over time, and thanks again for the opportunity to talk. Yes. Yes.
How long does it take for mispronounce the word, the neonicotinoid?
Yeah.
How long does it take for it to leach out of the soil if it's been used, say, for rose bushes?
Yeah.
Beer or what? Oh,
It stays in the soil for about 3 years, and so anything that grows there will take it in. That's the problem. So it persists in the soil for long periods of time, and even though it's focused on, you've got your target plant species, it leaches into the soil and into the groundwater, and then it can be taken up by other plants. And to what extent is poorly understood, but the mechanism is definitely there for it to very quickly be taken up by other plants, and it gets into the pollen and nectar as well as the plant material. So, there are a lot of herbivores that are important at the ecological level that we might not like, but they could be affected by this as well. And so, they're food for birds and other things as well. And if you're killing them off, then that may have effects as well. So there's a whole other side of the neonicotinoids that hasn't been examined, but it happens pretty quickly and persists for long periods of time. Yeah. Yes.
There's a good question on the hibernating cycle.
Yeah.
Of the queen.
Yeah.
So when a queen came into my basement,
Yeah.
I felt really bad because I think I sent her out to her death when I put her outside.
Probably. Well, yeah.
So, generally, what can somebody do?
You can contact me and I'll come and get it for you. And if you have nests I would love it if you find a nest, because the one thing about this is it's very difficult to find the nest sites. So if you have a nest, and I've done this a lot, people have them in their air conditioning unit, and I do it in a non-invasive way. I'm not coming in with my sledgehammer to get into your wall or anything. So if it's accessible, I'll come in and get it from you. But yeah, I mean, if it's winter and you've got a bee in there, and I mean, I have kids too. Oh yeah.
The weather's been so crazy. I'm sure that she came out of hibernation because it was a warm day. But
Yeah,
really
that's
cold
right.
day.
So if you can open a window or help the one thing about bees, especially the foragers and the queens to some extent, is it's not like a yellow jacket that's actually trying to sting you. Bees, like I put them in vials at Breakneck or wherever and look at them. I can ID them. I let them go. They go right back to the flower and start working. They're very
Docile.
yes. Some species aren't like that, but the ones at Breakneck are pretty docile. So, and the males don't have stingers, so if you can tell them apart, you could just grab them with your hand and throw them out. But I would suggest training before you try that one as well. So, Yeah, if you can get them outside, that would be great, but other than that.
Can they survive like in the weather that we've been having
Oh,
recently?
certainly.
Just
So
flying?
these bees can be super chilled down to, so when we mark bees, so I put paint on them, I put them in the fridge, and it looks like they're dead, right? They curl up, and I paint them colors because I want to tell individuals. They warm up, and they just go back to their business. So if you could get it into a container and put it in the fridge, it would chill down, and then you could easily take it outside, or if you get in a container, you just let it go outside. They're fine. In the 40s, I've seen bees flying outside. So they've got fat, and they've got they can generate heat themselves as well. So that's not a problem. They're adapted for that. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question about your methodology. Actually, just raised a good point. When we're out at Breakneck Hill counting the individual bees,
Yes.
do you think you have recurrent individuals?
Great question. Yes, I'm pretty sure I do. So yes, so last year was the pilot study, and so these numbers are probably inflated to some extent. I think the patterns still hold, and I think that the preferences still hold. But this year what we're doing is we are marking individuals so we can get us an idea of the population. And ideally, if I could find colonies, because it's very difficult to tell if all of the workers you see, if you have a small number, come from the same colony or different colonies, which makes it's a big deal in terms of the conservation and the population. So we're going to try to get a handle on that this year, but that's a good question. So that's how we're trying to address that. We're going to, every time we go through, we're going to mark a certain number of individuals, and then there are equations you can use to figure out what the population size based on mark recapture. Yeah. Yes?
What can we do in our yards to maybe stimulate or create bumblebee nesting?
Nesting?
Yeah.
Right. Another good question. So just like in terms of these preferences, in terms of nest site preferences, we know virtually nothing. So the conservation groups say, so I know that, so bees definitely are either surface nesters, or they have the abandoned nest sites, rodent nests, or they do both. So if I would say to put out a big mound of hay or dry grass that the surface nesters would like. In terms of the underground, unless you want to maintain a rodent population, it's difficult to do stuff for them. But if you have logs, like don't clear it out. If you leave debris, if you have like a forested area, if you sort of leave the fallen branches, or if you have a tree that's fallen over, if you leave that, they can dig under that and use that as nest site. But it's a good question, and really I don't have a great answer to that at this particular time. So I see you shaking your head about leaving things. Yes? No?
Thinking that we have a lot of, we about the conservation land, we were both laughing because we have a lot of the trees are down.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
We're both going.
I thought you were like, no, I thought that there was something I was missing about, you should never do that. And I'm like, uh-oh, I don't want controversy. But we're hoping to find some nests at Breakneck to try to understand the species preferences at that level. And I put in grants to NSF to try to figure those things out. And really, I don't really have a good answer for you. But if you find a nest, tell me about it, because then I can put that into the database to try to see if everybody in here found a nest, that would be a pretty good start to say maybe you should do this or that. Yeah.
So have you found any nests at Breakneck Hill?
Not so far. I think there might be one. I got some pictures were posted today where there might be one. But I'm continuing to look. Last year the focus was mostly on the workers, and I got out there later on. I was definitely looking for nests, but not as actively as we are this year, trying to find the nests. So, yes?
The pattern of the day that they indicate when they're active and when they come up from the nest?
Yeah, no, a lot of these species can come out at really low light levels. And so the nectar replenishes overnight, and so you'll see a big surge in bee activity early in the morning. It dies down midday, the flowers replenish, and then you see another increase in activity later in the afternoon. But as far as I can tell, the species themselves don't have staggered periods of activity. I've seen them all out together early, and I've done the surveys in the afternoon, and I see the same numbers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because honeybees.
Yeah.
When the sun comes up and gets warm, they'll leave.
Yeah, so the bumblebees, they don't need it to be as warm, and I think they're out at lower light levels. Certainly some species are out. I could barely see, and I can hear them on flowers. So they're likely, those are probably the olfactory driven ones versus visual, or I don't know what the mechanism is, but they're certainly able to go under really low light conditions and really low temperature, which again is a competitive advantage to other bees and pollinators. All right, yes?
You were going to expand into a bird bee.
Yes, that's right.
What? Can you expand on that a little bit?
I certainly can. So the idea is that there are native plant species that are shared by birds and bees. So the bees are using them as a source of nectar and pollen, and the birds are using them as a source of food as well, or a nest site. And so I'm working with a new faculty member at WPI that knows the bird side and grassland habitats to try to look at these interactions. So we're going to try to link the bird species to particular plants and the bee species that are pollinating those plants. So we're looking at that this summer at Wachusett Meadow. We're going to start, but she's also coming out to Breakneck to look to see if the habitat's right, if the bird species are there that we can study. Yeah. Yeah.
So have you scheduled an ID workshop yet?
No, I haven't. I've said. I feel I've committed to one, but I don't have a date or time. I know it's going to be after June 2nd because I have a big deadline June 2nd. So probably I'll agree to the first week in June. When the workers are out, it's the first, second week of June. So I'd like people to be trained before those peaks that you saw. So probably let's say June 8th to 10th-ish.
So, thank you, Rob.
Oh, yeah.
We can go back to some questions. I just wanted to fill in a little bit about that. Earlier, I'd introduced people here from our different committees, but how many people in the room attended and participated in the survey last week? So, we're going to have another training, and when it comes to bumblebees, I'll say there's not enough ID training. I spent a couple hours on a photo of a great bumblebee, and I had the ID book out, and I came up with my best guesses, and Rob said, it's a fly.
That's how good those fly mimics are.
So,
She failed my bell ringer. I put the slides on.
So, yeah. But what we do is we'll be scheduling a training ID workshop, and what the workshop entails for time commitment is really what you can give. It can be more intense or less, but just walking around and at Breakneck Hill doing a set. I'm hoping this year we'll get people to commit to a certain trail or a segment and taking pictures, but it's like if you're up there and you see a bumblebee, take a picture, set up a Facebook page so everyone can post it. He's really looking at the plant bumblebee connection, and I found it fascinating because before meeting Rob and attending this, I didn't pay attention. I mean, I didn't know that they were dancing and collecting pollen, and there was pollen on their legs, and long tongue, short tongue bees. Who knew? And it was actually the first question. We were planting some gardens up there, and I wanted to know we were doing it for butterflies, and what would be good plants for bumblebees, and you have to have plants from the early season on, except for the bumblebees come out really early, so now we need to be looking at what's in bloom in March. And then he hit me with this, the curveball of, well, different length-tongued bees need different shaped flowers, so it's having the types of flowers they need, and he's finding more information. So, I kept asking for a list, and part of this project is helping to create that. We did use some of his suggestions, and we'll be following up. But the first section of Breakneck Hill is where these interpretive gardens, and we'll have signage are going for both bumblebees and butterflies. But the whole property, that's only like an acre and a half. 90 acres of Breakneck Hill is his survey land, and what's occurring there is more realistic of what's going on in the real world. But what you do in your own yard, and I wanted to mention a couple of things. This book here, we were hoping to get some bumblebee guides, but the library was really great in getting us these books. Bringing Nature Home, mind-boggling, it's worth the read. And this is from Xerces Society Gardening for Butterflies. I'm sure some of the information would be helpful with the bumblebees as well. But like you said, the neonicotinoids, who knew? And we got some really good native plants and there were no bumblebees on it. He goes, well, maybe there's no nectar. And we're going to have to test it this year. I think you can put a little box over the flower overnight so that...
I have one.
Yes, well, because you don't want, you can't tell if the bumblebees got it before you got there, or other ants or other, other pollinators. So is it really nectarless, or did somebody already get it? And these are things whoever thought of. The neonicotinoids, who thought you were bringing home beautiful flowers for your garden, and one, there's poison that they were grown in, and two, that they've been cultivated to get the nectar and the pollen, and you got a pretty flower with just really no value.